wake him up.
Morning light threaded through the blinds and pooling on the quilt where Jihoon lay sprawled, one arm thrown over his forehead. The bedroom door eased open as if on cue as 6 small boys crashed on him. "Appa!" they shouted in one chaotic chorus, voices thin and bright. Minjun led the pack, hair a mess, cheeks the color of ripe peaches. The others streamed behind him, Minho, Minsok, Minji, Minwo, Minbin, each a mirror of mischief. They made straight for the bed. Jihoon's sleep broke with the shock of weight. Little hands dug into his cheeks as Minjun vaulted onto his chest, while Minho and Minsok landed across his knees. Minji tried to hoist himself onto Jihoon's head, more ambitious than graceful, and Minwo and Minbin stuck to his shoulders like tiny, stubborn epaulets. Freya's breath hitched. For a moment she watched, one hand pressed to her mouth, part of her stunned by the intimacy of the tableau. A sleeping man switched to laughing and wrestling in seconds because of 6 small hands. But the laughter on Jihoon's lips was thin, surprise and something else tangled in it. He was awake now, eyes opening to find his bedroom turned into a battleground of giggles and limbs, his hair a nest of small fingers. Freya's heart was a flurry of small, urgent birds. She moved barefoot across polished wood, the soles of her feet cool against the floor, holding a stack of folders and a box of cranes for the boys. She had rehearsed the routine in her head for days now. She told herself again that she was only there to do a job, to keep the children occupied. She tried not to think of the other thing, the night that had lived in her memory like a private ember, burning bright and shameful. She had left before dawn, before embarrassment could take shape. "Boys," Jihoon said, voice groggy but instantly steady. He reached up to catch Minji before the child sagged off his crown. The movement was automatic. He knew the exact weight of each boy already, the positions their bodies fell into around him. He blinked, and when his gaze landed on Freya framed in the doorway, hair pinned back, cheeks flushed, the morning light haloing her, something unreadable passed across his face. Freya felt a cold wash of something that was almost shame, and then a fierce, irrational protectiveness for the children who tumbled over him. "I'm sorry, Jihoon," she said, but her voice was small. "I thought, I can take them to the kitchen. I brought cereal." Jihoon's eyes held hers an extra beat. Recognition moved through him like a current that stilled the room. He sat up slowly, the boy's weight shifting, and studied her as if cataloguing. His hand brushed hair from his brow and halted halfway, because her face, Freya's face, stole him back to a night he had told himself meant nothing, and yet had changed the coordinates of his life. The shock was public and private. His jaw tightened. His voice kept the smooth, controlled cadence of a man who ran companies and managed crises, but something soft and stunned lived beneath it. "You brought them cereal?" he asked, low. "Yes," she said, because to lie would be to unspool something she didn't know how to tie back together. I'll get it." She stepped forward to take Minjun's hand and guide him out of the bed, but Minjun planted his feet and clung to Jihoon's shirt, testing him like a tiny anchor. "Appa, tell story," he begged. Jihoon's smile came then, rare, private, and meant only for these children. For a second, he was not the polished CEO whose face flooded magazine covers. He was a man undone into tenderness, and Freya felt the wrongness of the knowledge settle in her like a stone. The boys were his, she saw it in the way they matched him, in the immediate trust that radiated between them. He recognized their shape in the air and their cadence of breath. Something like grief and reprieve crossed his features at once. "Story," Jihoon echoed. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender, and the boys erupted into victory. "Fine. One story. But then you have to eat." Freya's hand closed around Minjun's tiny knuckles. She felt the heat of his skin and the steady pull of the moment, the small gravity of a family in motion. She wanted to do the right thing, to keep the children fed and safe and out of the complicated border where adults' past sometimes bled into their lives. But she also felt his gaze travel to her with an intensity that unmoored her. There was no accusation there, not yet, only human recognition and an unreadable question that tugged at the edges of the long night they had shared. Jihoon's voice softened as he addressed the boys. "Who made your breakfast yesterday?" One of the twins, Minji? No, Minbin, chimed in with a nonsense rhyme about pancakes. Laughter spilled like sunlight. Freya moved to the doorway, the box of crayons now balanced on one arm, the folders shifted to cushion the movement. She took a breath and looked at Jihoon again, and in that glance they both seemed to hold the same secret and the same fear, that yesterday could reach into the daylight and demand an explanation. Jihoon's hand brushed a pillow aside and patted the space beside him. He invited, without words, a truce or at least a parley. The boys scrambled to obey, piling like warm pebbles into a fanning arc. He turned to Freya and said her name as if testing it in air, Freya. Her name on his lips folded the room differently. It sounded not like a label but like a thing remembered, a night, a laugh, a hush. She felt the pulse at her throat flare and then settle. Yes, she said, simple as a ledger entry, but the word carried the load of everything she had left unsaid when she fled. Good, he replied, with the calm of a man recalibrating. Stay. Eat with them. I'll be up in a moment. Freya blinked. His face held no reproach. Instead it offered a possibility, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition and a practical plan to hold a morning steady for 6 children. She almost wanted to refuse. Pride and fear sat with her like 2 watchful elders, but her good sense, the part that had kept her afloat through moves and new jobs, nudged her forward. She stepped into the room, the smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen downstairs, and let herself be folded into a scene that felt dangerously, heartbreakingly domestic. As she passed him, their shoulders brushed. The contact was brief, an electric punctuation. For a split second the world narrowed to that warmth, to the press of familiarity, to the knowledge that the man who had been the architect of her briefest fall now held the most delicate things in his arms. Minjun snuggled against his chest and sighed, convinced and content. Jihoon looked at Freya then, and there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, the kind that made decision feel like invitation. Tell him the story about the moon, Jihoon murmured to Minjun, and his voice kept the quiet command of someone used to being obeyed and suddenly, gratifyingly, adored. Freya stood at the doorway and listened, cranes heavy in her hands, while the boys' voices folded into one another and the day outside uncurled beyond the blinds. Inside, the past and present sat in the same room, breathing the same air, and the next move felt uncertain and electric. The apartment smelled like coffee and toast and the faint citrus of laundry detergent, clean and domestic, as if the place had been waiting for small hands to make it a home. Jihoon sat propped against a leaning headboard, Minjun curled against his chest, Minho and Minsok draped over his knees. Minji clutched a crane like a talisman while Minwo and Minbin argued about which dinosaur could fly. Jihoon's long fingers absently smoothed Minjun's hair, careful and precise, the same way he smoothed contracts and presentations in the boardroom. Freya watched him from the kitchen arch, a bowl in her hands, feeling both needed and perilously exposed. The breakfast ritual was efficient and forgiving. Freya poured cereal into paper bowls and wet the spoon tips so the boys wouldn't chip their teeth. She hummed a tune she'd taught them months ago, some nonsense chant about astronauts and pancakes, and they sang back, syrupy laughter piping out between verses. Jihoon watched from the doorway, eyes on the little constellation of boys, then drifting to Freya as if mapping her features anew. The way sunlight caught the high planes of her cheekbones, the habitual small crease between her brows when she concentrated. Recognition in him had been immediate the morning he found them, but what followed was not the volatile drama Freya feared. Instead there was a grave, slow curiosity, like a man reading the first page of a book that might change his life. Minjun, eat, Jihoon said, his voice soft but firm. He reached for a stray crane and frowned the barest bit, concern for a simple thing. Don't put that in your mouth. A chorus of protest and muttered bargains rose from the table. Freya moved among them, a practiced conductor, scooping, cutting, and reminding. Her hands felt steady. The rhythm of caring was familiar and merciful. It allowed her to be both present and contained, to give her heart some armor while it pulsed in a place she tried to ignore. When the boys were distracted with a stack of toast, Jihoon poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one beside the sink. He watched her with a look she'd come to understand a little, businesslike, assessing, but threaded now with something warmer. He folded his hands around the cup as if searching for warmth more than caffeine. I need to go into the office, he said finally. There's a shareholder meeting today. Freya nodded. I can keep them until after lunch. Her voice was certain, jagged edges of nerves tightened at the admission that staying felt dangerous. She had left before, fleeing a morning that could unmake her dignity. She told herself disappearing was the only clean option. But mornings with these boys were not theoretical. They were an accumulation of scraped knees, bedtime negotiations, and sticky-handed hugs that made mistakes feel smaller. Jihoon's gaze slipped from her face to the hallway phone on the counter and back. "There's a driver. I'll have someone take them to the playroom at the office if you think that's better." Freya paused. Playroom at the office. The image was absurd, a corporate skyscraper with a nursery hidden like a secret. It was also practical. "They like the office toys," she admitted. She saw Jihoon relax the slightest degree at that. He smiled then, a private, almost guilty upturn of one corner of his mouth, and it softened him in a way that disarmed her. "You've been good with them," he said. "They listen to you." Freya suppressed a laugh she didn't trust. "They listen when bribed with cartoons." He didn't laugh. He watched her as if storing her in a tidy file, then closed it with decisiveness. "Walk their backpacks to the car," he said. "I'll be back before lunch." The logistics of the morning unspooled, small and mundane. Shoes hunted for, Minji's favorite dinosaur toy found under the couch, Minwo and Minbin arguing about seat orders in the car. Jihoon's driver honked downstairs at the appointed time, a punctual, comforting sound. Jihoon cordoned off the children with practiced, gentle authority, issuing the same quick, clear orders a CEO might give in a crisis. Freya felt herself relax into the ease of it. It was easier to breathe when life had a scheme and someone else drew the lines. As they walked down the slick staircase and into the street, Seoul opened up in glossy streaks of neon and steel. The city was brisk and unself-conscious, an organism that demanded speed and rewarded precision. The driver's van idled, tinted windows offering one-way privacy like a shield. The boys chatted about dinosaurs and cars, occupying themselves with a ferocity that bordered on theatrical. Freya buckled two of them into adjacent seats and handed Jihoon a small sticky note scribbled with each child's nap schedule. He took it from her hand and briefly held the pad between them. His fingers were warm, and the space where their skin met held a quiet electricity. For a second Jihoon's eyes searched her face, then dipped to the list with the same immediate focus he gave schedules and budgets. "You left in the night," he said without preamble as the van rolled away from the curb. It was not a question exactly. It was a statement of fact that hung between them like a piece of glass. Freya's throat closed. She had rehearsed 1,000 refusals and explanations, yet he said it plainly, giving her neither villainy nor pity. "I had to," she said. Truthful and tight. "I couldn't." "You didn't want to feel disgraced," he finished for her, his voice neither cruel nor indulgent. It was quieter than she expected and cut more cleanly because the thought had been lodged in her the night she left. She had been convinced her absence would be the right correction. Instead, the hole she'd left had rearranged their lives in ways she'd not predicted. The van hummed toward the business district. Freya watched the city slide past in a smear of glass and motion, feeling the weight of him, of his assertion that the children were his and that she had left, set like a new axis around which their lives would revolve. It was a delicate tilt, public lives and private reckoning aligning with the soft, inevitable pull of gravity. Jihoon's hand, when it brushed her knee to point something out to the driver, was casual and anchored. The gesture was small, intimate, as if claiming a geography as much as indicating a direction. Freya felt a bloom of something hot in her chest and turned her gaze to the window, watching Seoul unfold. The city was indifferent to their private calculus, its millions of inhabitants scavenging for meaning among offices and subway tars and neon. She had promised herself to be practical. She would keep the boys' routine. She would do the work they paid her for, be efficient and invisible where she could. But in the soft, electric moments between the children's jokes and the hiss of traffic, the memory of him, his hands, his voice, the way his mouth had held hers, threaded through like a dangerous perfume. Jihoon noticed the way her jaw clenched once and, without looking, moved his hand again to steady her knee. It was nearly casual, the touch, but its simplicity made it dangerous. "Do you want me to call your family?" he asked, and the question landed oddly. It was practical, yes, but also a boundary he was offering, help within the frame of order, respect for distance. Freya's laugh was small, brittle. "My family is in Lagos," she said. Saying the name of her city felt like setting it on a map between them, an ocean that felt both too real and safe. "They can't help in Seoul." She looked at him finally, meeting his steady, inscrutable eyes. "I can do this." Jihoon nodded as if accepting that and not accepting it at the same time. He worked like that, Decisions made with an eye to both business outcomes and a surprising softness toward the people he held in orbit. There was a duality to him that fascinated and unnerved her. A man who ran corporations who also hollowed himself out to make room for 6 small bodies. When they arrived at the office, the doors of the van opened to a lobby that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. A woman with a badge smiled, and the boys were whisked into an elevator adorned with childish decals. Jihoon watched them go, the corners of his mouth curving with a pride she couldn't quite parse, then turned back to Freya. "Stay for a minute," he said. "There are a few things we need to sort, schedules, guardianship documents. I don't want anything to be left to chance." Freya nodded, torn between eager curiosity and a cautious fear. "Okay." He handed her a keycard without preamble, the gesture formal yet intimate. Their fingers brushed for the fraction of a second it took, and in that small contact something moved, a concession that their lives could not be unmade easily. As the elevator dinged and the office swallowed them into its hum, Freya tucked the keycard into her palm like a promise or a threat, she couldn't decide which. The day opened with 1,000 tiny tasks, but under it all was a current, the knowledge that a single night had forged an unanticipated family, and 2 adults had to decide whether to be architects or refugees from that structure. The city did not wait, it pressed onward. Freya followed, pragmatic, vigilant, aware that every step with him would be a negotiation between desire and the careful armor she'd spent years building. The office felt like a different world from the warmth of the apartment, cool, glass-walled, and precise. Everything moved with intention. Assistants walked briskly in heels that clicked like punctuation, elevators opened and closed with a quiet efficiency, and voices were kept low, as though ambition itself required silence to thrive. Freya stayed close to Jihoon as they stepped out of the elevator. The keycard he had given her rested in her palm, warm from her skin. It felt heavier than it should, like a symbol she hadn't agreed to carry but couldn't put down. "This way," Jihoon said, his hand briefly touching the small of her back to guide her forward. The contact was light, almost professional, but it lingered. Freya felt it travel through her like a slow spark. She stiffened just slightly, enough that he noticed, and his hand dropped almost immediately. "Sorry," he murmured, though his tone held no real regret, only awareness. Freya shook her head. "It's fine." It wasn't, not really. Every small touch between them felt amplified now, loaded with memory. They entered his office, and it was exactly what she expected, sleek, expansive, overlooking a stretch of soul that glittered with life. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living painting. A large desk sat near the center, immaculate, everything aligned with near-obsessive precision. Jihoon shrugged off his jacket and placed it over the back of his chair. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the couch. Freya sat, smoothing her skirt unconsciously. She watched him move, confident, controlled, entirely in his element. This was his territory. Not the bedroom where she had seen him vulnerable under a pile of laughing children, but the world where he commanded respect without effort. He picked up a folder and handed it to her. "Legal documents," he said. "Temporary guardianship, school registration, medical authorization. I've already started the process." Freya blinked, flipping through the pages. Everything was detailed, thorough, names, dates, provisions. Her chest tightened. "You move fast," she said quietly. "I have to," Jihoon replied. 6 children don't leave room for hesitation. There was no arrogance in his voice, just fact. Freya nodded slowly. "And me?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, really looked. "What about you?" Her fingers tightened slightly around the papers. "Where do I fit in all this?" The question hung between them, heavier than anything else in the room. Jihoon didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, hands slipping into his pockets as he looked out over the city. For a moment, he seemed far away, not distant from her, but deep in thought. Then he turned. "You're already in it," he said simply. Freya's breath caught. "That's not an answer," she said. "It is," he replied, stepping closer. "You've been raising them. You know them better than anyone. They trust you." "And you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Jihoon stopped just in front of her. Close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the quiet gravity he carried. "I'm still figuring that out," he said. Honest. Disarming. Freya looked down, then back up at him. You recognized them immediately. Yes. And you're not angry? She asked. A faint crease appeared between his brows. I was, he admitted. For about 5 minutes. She let out a small, surprised breath. And then, she asked. He studied her face, as if weighing how much truth to give. And then I realized anger wouldn't change anything, he said. They're here. You're here. Something softened in his voice. And I don't regret that. The words landed deep. Freya swallowed. You should, she said, though there was no conviction behind it. Jihoon's gaze sharpened slightly. Do you? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because the truth was complicated. She didn't regret the children. Not for a second. But him? That was where things unraveled. I regret leaving, she said finally. Jihoon exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for a long time. Good, he said. Freya frowned. Good. Yes, he said. Because it means you might not run again. The words were quiet, but they struck hard. Freya stood abruptly, the movement more emotional than intentional. I didn't run, she said. I made a decision. To disappear, he countered. Her eyes flashed. To protect myself. Jihoon stepped closer, closing the distance between them. From what? From this, she said, gesturing between them. From being the woman who slept with her boss and stayed. I wasn't your boss then. That doesn't change how it looks, she shot back. Silence fell. Heavy. Charged. Jihoon's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes. You care too much about how things look. Freya let out a small, incredulous laugh. And you don't. No, he said simply. She stared at him. That's not true. It is, he said. I care about what's real. The air shifted. Freya felt it, that pull again. The same one from that night. Stronger now, because it wasn't just physical. It was layered with history, with consequences, with something dangerously close to truth. You're very sure of yourself, she murmured. Jihoon's mouth curved slightly. Not about everything. His hand lifted, slowly, deliberately, and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. This time, he didn't pull back. Freya's breath hitched. You should stop, she whispered. Why? He asked, his voice lower now. Because I won't. But she didn't say it. Instead, she shook her head faintly. This is a bad idea. Jihoon leaned in just enough that his breath brushed her skin. Then why aren't you moving away? He murmured. She didn't have an answer. And that was all the permission he needed. His lips met hers, soft at first, testing. Not rushed, not demanding. Just, certain. Freya froze for half a second. Then she melted. Her hands found his shirt, gripping lightly as the kiss deepened. It wasn't frantic like the first time. It was slower, deliberate, like they were learning each other instead of escaping into each other. Jihoon's hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, grounding her. The world outside the glass walls disappeared. There was only this. This heat. This pull. This undeniable, dangerous connection. Freya broke the kiss first, her breath uneven. She stepped back, pressing her fingers lightly to her lips as if to steady herself. We can't do that, she said. Jihoon didn't move. His gaze stayed on her, dark and steady. We already did, he replied. She shook her head. I mean again. A pause. Then, quietly. That might be a problem. Freya let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a surrender. Yes, she said. It is. But neither of them stepped further away. And that was the real problem. The tension followed them out of the office like a second shadow. Freya tried to focus on practical things, the boys, their lunch, the schedule Jihoon had mapped out, but her body still remembered the kiss. It lingered in the way her lips tingled, in the way her pulse refused to settle into anything resembling calm. Jihoon, on the other hand, moved as though nothing had happened. That unsettled her even more. He walked beside her through the corridor, issuing brief instructions to passing staff, his tone composed, his expression unreadable. If anyone looked closely, they might have noticed the slight roughness in his voice, or the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long when it landed on her, but no one looked that closely. Playroom is on the 12th floor, he said as they stepped into the elevator. Freya nodded, folding her arms loosely across her chest. She kept her eyes on the numbers lighting up above the door. Silence pressed in. Then, "You're avoiding me." Freya exhaled slowly. "I'm standing right next to you." "That's not the same thing." She turned to look at him. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," he said. She gave a short laugh. "You wouldn't like it." "Try me." The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors slid open before she could respond. Saved by timing. Or delayed. The playroom was bright and alive with color, soft mats, shelves of toys, tiny tables scattered with puzzles and blocks. The boys spotted them instantly. "Mommy." The word hit the air without warning. Freya froze. It wasn't the first time they had said it, but saying it here, in Jihoon's world, changed something. Made it real in a way she couldn't brush aside. Jihoon stilled beside her. Not shocked. Not confused. Just aware. 6 small bodies collided into her at once, wrapping around her legs, her waist, her arms. She laughed despite herself, crouching to gather them close. "Hey, my loves," she said softly, kissing Minjun's forehead. Jihoon watched. There was something in his expression now, something deeper than curiosity. Something that looked a lot like quiet acceptance, and something else he hadn't named yet. Minho tugged at his hand. "Appa, come." Jihoon let himself be pulled into the chaos. Freya stood slowly, brushing her hands over her skirt as she watched him kneel among them. He didn't hesitate. Didn't hold back. "You are," he said. "Even when you're not pretending to be busy." She paused. Set the plate down. Then slowly turned to face him. The distance between them felt smaller now. More dangerous. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. "Like what?" "Like you're thinking something you're not saying." Jihoon pushed off the counter. Took a step closer. "I usually say what I'm thinking." Freya's pulse quickened. "Then say it." A beat. Then, "I want you to stay." Her breath caught. Stay. Such a simple word. Such a complicated meaning. "For the kids?" she asked quietly. Jihoon's gaze didn't waver. "Not just for them." The honesty in his voice made it harder to breathe. Freya shook her head slightly. "That's not a good idea." "Why not?" "You know why." "Say it anyway." She hesitated. Then, "Because I don't trust myself around you." The words landed between them, raw and unfiltered. Jihoon didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked certain. "Good," he said softly. Freya frowned. "Why do you keep saying that like it's a good thing?" "Because it means you feel it too." "Feel it?" As if that simplified anything. "It's not that simple," she said. "It is," he replied. "You're just making it complicated." Freya let out a quiet, frustrated breath. "We have 6 kids, Jihoon." "I'm aware. I work for you. That can change." "And what happens when this," she gestured between them, "goes wrong?" Jihoon stepped closer. Close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "Who says it will?" "I do," she said. "Because things like this always do." His expression softened, just slightly. "Not everything ends badly," he said. Freya searched his face. "You really believe that?" she asked. "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then looked away. "That's dangerous," she murmured. Jihoon reached out then, his fingers brushing her chin, gently turning her face back toward him. "What's more dangerous," he said quietly, "is pretending this isn't happening." Her heart pounded. She could feel it now, clearer than ever. The pull. The heat. The inevitability of it. "You're not going to stop, are you?" she whispered. "No." The answer came without hesitation. Freya exhaled slowly. Then, "Neither am I." That was all it took. Jihoon closed the distance between them, his hand sliding to her waist, pulling her firmly against him. This time, the kiss was deeper. Slower. Intentional. Freya responded fully, her hands moving up to his shoulders, then into his hair, holding him there as if grounding herself in something she had already lost control of. The world narrowed again. No past. No future. Just now. His touch was steady, confident, but not rushed. Like he was savoring her instead of consuming her. Freya felt it everywhere. And she stopped fighting it. Just for this moment. Just this once. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, neither of them stepped away immediately. Foreheads nearly touching. Breath mingling. This is a mistake, she murmured. Jihoon's lips brushed hers again, softer this time. Probably, he said. She let out a quiet, breathless laugh. And for the first time, she didn't try to run. Morning came too quickly. Freya woke to silence. The rare, fragile kind that only existed before 6 children opened their eyes and filled the world with noise. For a moment, she didn't move. She lay still, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, her thoughts slow to catch up with her body. Then it all rushed back. The apartment. The boys. Jihoon. And last night. Her chest tightened slightly as she sat up, pressing her palm against her forehead. She had fallen asleep in one of the guest rooms, but sleep hadn't been peaceful. It had been full of half-dreams and blurred memories, his voice, his touch, the way she had stopped resisting. That was a mistake, she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, she didn't fully believe it. A small knock broke her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door creaked open. Minjun peeked in, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Mommy, hungry," he mumbled. Freya's expression softened instantly. "Come here," she said gently, opening her arms. He shuffled over and climbed into her lap without hesitation, curling against her like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. She held him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead, grounding herself in something simple and real. "I'll make breakfast," she murmured. Minjun nodded against her, already drifting again. Freya carried him to the kitchen, the quiet apartment slowly beginning to stir. One by one, the others followed, Minho dragging his blanket, Minsok arguing with Minji about something incomprehensible, Minwo and Minbin whispering secrets that would inevitably turn into chaos. Normal. Safe. Manageable. Freya moved through the routine easily, cracking eggs, pouring juice, reminding them to sit still. She almost forgot about everything else. Almost. Until Jihoon walked in. He looked like he hadn't been asleep long, but somehow still composed. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair slightly damp as if he had just showered. Freya's movement stilled for half a second. Then resumed. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, not looking at him. The boys greeted him loudly, immediately pulling him into their orbit. "Appa. Sit. Appa, look. Appa, he took my spoon." Jihoon handled it with quiet ease, stepping in, resolving minor disputes, sitting among them like he had always been there. Freya kept her focus on the stove. But she could feel it again. That awareness. Stronger now in the daylight. More complicated. "You didn't sleep much," Jihoon said after a moment. She glanced at him briefly. "Neither did you." A pause. Then, "No," he admitted. Their eyes met. And held. Too long. Freya looked away first, turning back to the pan. "We should focus on the kids," she said. "We are," he replied calmly. "That's not what I mean." "I know." She exhaled slowly, setting a plate down a little harder than necessary. "This, whatever this is, it's going to make things messy." Jihoon leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her. "Things are already messy," he said. "That doesn't mean we should make it worse." His gaze sharpened slightly. "You think this makes it worse?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Why?" Freya turned to face him fully now. "Because it complicates everything," she said. "Because feelings change things. Because if this goes wrong, it affects them too." She gestured toward the boys. Jihoon followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. "It doesn't have to go wrong." "You keep saying that like it's guaranteed," she said. "And you keep assuming the opposite." "Because that's realistic." "No," he said quietly. "That's fear." The word landed harder than she expected. Freya's jaw tightened slightly. "Maybe." Jihoon stood then, moving closer, but not too close. Not like last night. Measured. Careful. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now," he said. "I'm asking you not to run from it before it even starts." Freya studied his face. There was no pressure there. No force. Just steadiness. And that somehow made it harder to resist. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Neither do I, he said. That surprised her. You don't, she asked. He shook his head slightly. No. But I'm willing to figure it out. Freya felt something shift in her chest. Small. But real. Before she could respond, Minbin's voice cut in. Mommy. He took my juice again. Freya blinked, the tension breaking instantly. Minwo, she said, already moving toward them. Give it back. Jihoon watched her go, something unreadable in his expression. The moment passed. But it didn't disappear. It lingered. Later that morning, after breakfast and a minor battle over getting dressed, the boys were settled with toys in the living room. Freya stood by the window, watching the city below. Jihoon joined her. Quietly. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, I meant what I said, he told her. She didn't look at him. I know. And? Freya exhaled slowly. And I'm not running, she said. That was the truth. Even if it scared her. Jihoon's voice softened slightly. That's enough for now. She finally turned to him. And you? She asked. I'm not stopping, he said. A small, almost reluctant smile tugged at her lips. I didn't expect you to. He returned it, just barely. Then, without overthinking it, without turning it into something bigger, Freya stepped closer. Close enough to feel the warmth of him. Close enough to choose. She reached for his hand. Just his hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like it wasn't the first time. Like it wouldn't be the last. And this time, there was no rush. The rain began in the afternoon. It came softly at first, a mist against the windows, barely noticeable. Then it deepened into a steady rhythm, tapping against the glass and washing soul in silver. Inside the apartment, everything felt slower. Quieter. Freya sat on the floor with the boys, helping them build a lopsided tower of blocks that kept collapsing under Minji's creative improvements. Laughter filled the room in bursts, warm and bright, but beneath it, her thoughts drifted. Her hand brushed Minjun's shoulder as she steadied the structure, but her attention wasn't fully there. It kept circling back. To him. To this morning. To the way his hand had felt in hers, simple, steady, grounding. Dangerous. You're distracted. Freya blinked, looking up. Jihoon stood a few steps away, watching her. The boys barely noticed him now, too focused on their game. I'm fine, she said. He didn't move closer. Didn't push. You're thinking too much again. She gave a faint smile. That's kind of my thing. Try not to. Also not my thing. That earned the smallest hint of amusement in his expression. Freya looked back at the boys, but she could still feel his gaze on her. Constant. Not heavy. Just, there. Later, when the boys settled down with the cartoon, Freya stepped onto the balcony. The rain had cooled the air, and the city stretched out below, blurred slightly by the falling water. She wrapped her arms around herself, exhaling slowly. It was easier out here. Easier to think. Easier to pretend things weren't shifting under her feet. The balcony door slid open behind her. She didn't turn. You always come out here when you need space, Jihoon said. It wasn't a question. Freya let out a quiet breath. It helps. He stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not touching. Respecting the space. For now. They stood like that for a moment, watching the rain. Then. I meant what I said earlier, he told her. Freya tilted her head slightly. You're going to have to be more specific. I'm not stopping. She huffed a soft breath. You're very persistent. Yes. She glanced at him. That's not always a good thing. It is when I'm right. Freya shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips despite herself. You really believe that, don't you? I do. The confidence in his voice should have annoyed her. Instead, it grounded her. She looked back out at the city. And what if I'm not ready? Jihoon didn't hesitate. Then we go at your pace. That caught her off guard. She turned to him fully now. You mean that? Yes. No pressure. No pressure. Freya studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. There wasn't any. Just quiet certainty. Something in her chest loosened. Not completely. But enough. Okay, she said softly. Jihoon's gaze softened slightly. Okay, he repeated. The word settled between them like an agreement. Not a promise. But a beginning. A gust of wind carried a light spray of rain onto the balcony, and Freya shivered slightly. Jihoon noticed immediately. Without a word, he stepped closer. This time, he didn't ask. He simply slipped his jacket off and draped it over her shoulders. Freya stilled. The fabric was warm, faintly carrying his scent. She closed her eyes for just a second, letting herself feel it. Then opened them again. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded once, but didn't step away. They were closer now. Naturally. Easily. Freya turned slightly toward him, her fingers brushing the edge of the jacket. You're different than I expected, she admitted. Jihoon raised an eyebrow. In a good way. She considered that. Yes, she said. A small pause. Most of the time. That earned a soft huff of laughter from him. I'll take that. The rain continued to fall around them, steady and calm. Freya looked up at him, really looked this time. At the way his expression softened when he wasn't trying to control it. At the way his eyes lingered on her, not intensely, not overwhelming, but consistently. Like she mattered. That was new. And it scared her. But not enough to make her step back. Jihoon, she said quietly. Yes. She hesitated. Then. If this goes wrong. He didn't let her finish. It won't. You don't know that. I know I won't let it. Freya searched his face again. You can't control everything. No, he said. But I can choose how I handle it. That answer felt real. Not perfect. Not ideal. But real. And somehow, that mattered more. Freya nodded slowly. Then, without overthinking it, she stepped closer. Close enough that there was no space left between them. Jihoon's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes. Waiting. Always giving her that choice. Freya lifted her hand, resting it lightly against his chest. I said no pressure, she murmured. This isn't pressure, he replied quietly. She held his gaze for a second longer. Then, closed the distance. The kiss was softer this time. Slower. Not driven by tension or restraint, but by something quieter. Intentional. Her fingers curled slightly against his shirt as his hand came to her waist, steady and warm. The rain, the city, everything else faded again. But this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right. When they pulled apart, neither of them moved far. Freya rested her forehead lightly against his chest, her breathing calm. Jihoon's hand remained at her waist, grounding but gentle. After a moment, she let out a soft breath. We're really doing this, she said. Yes, he replied. She nodded slightly. Then, almost to herself. Okay. Inside, one of the boys shouted loudly, followed by the unmistakable sound of something falling over. Freya laughed softly, pulling back. Reality, she said. Jihoon's lips curved slightly. Always. She slipped his jacket off and handed it back to him. But her fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary. Then she turned and headed inside. The next morning felt different. Freya noticed it in the way she moved through the apartment. No hesitation, no quiet second-guessing trailing behind her steps. The rhythm of the house had become familiar, almost instinctive now. 6 voices, 6 personalities, 1 shared orbit. And somehow, she was no longer standing outside of it. Mommy, hurry. Minho's voice rang out from the hallway, followed by the sound of running feet. Freya laughed lightly, grabbing a backpack. If you're late, it's your fault this time. It's not. Minji argued immediately. It's his. Jihoon stepped in smoothly, crouching slightly as he adjusted Minbin's jacket. Shoes first. Arguments later. Freya watched him, something warm settling deep in her chest. It wasn't surprising anymore. The way he showed up. The way he stayed. It had become something she depended on, and that realization didn't scare her the way it used to. That alone felt like a quiet kind of victory. The morning rush passed quickly, and soon the apartment emptied, leaving behind a rare stillness. For the first time in days, it was just the two of them again. Freya stood near the window, watching the city below, her arms loosely folded. Jihoon approached quietly, stopping beside her. "You're not thinking about leaving anymore," he said. It wasn't a question. Freya smiled faintly. "No." A pause. Then she added, softer, "I'm thinking about staying." Jihoon turned slightly toward her. "That's a better plan." She glanced at him. "You always assume I'll come around." "I don't assume," he said. "I pay attention." Freya studied him for a moment. Then shook her head, a small smile forming. "You're dangerous." "I've heard that." "I mean it," she said. "You make things feel certain. And that's a problem." "It used to be." He didn't respond immediately. Just watched her. Waiting. Freya exhaled slowly, then turned to face him fully. "But not anymore," she said. The words landed gently. But they carried weight. Jihoon stepped closer. Freya didn't move back this time. "I don't want to keep fighting this," she admitted. "You don't have to." "I know." That was the difference now. She knew. And that changed everything. Freya lifted her hand, resting it against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. Real. Grounding. "Here. I was scared," she said quietly. "Of how fast it happened. Of what it meant." Jihoon's hand came to rest over hers. "You're allowed to be." She shook her head slightly. "I think I was more scared of losing it." That made him pause. Just for a second. Then, "You won't," he said. Freya met his eyes. "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted. "But I can promise I won't walk away." And this time, she believed him because he had already proven it, in every small, consistent way that mattered. Freya smiled softly, then closed the distance. The kiss was unhurried. Warm. Certain. No hesitation left between them. Jihoon's hand settled at her waist, pulling her closer, and she let him, completely, without resistance. For the first time. It didn't feel like something temporary. It felt like something that could last. When they pulled apart, Freya rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing briefly. "We should probably pick them up soon," she murmured. Jihoon's lips brushed hers again, softer this time. "Probably." Neither of them moved right away. And they didn't need to. Because this wasn't something fragile anymore. It wasn't something they were trying to figure out. It was something they had chosen. Together. Later that afternoon, the apartment filled with noise again. Laughter, arguments, small footsteps racing across the floor. Life. Messy. Loud. Perfect in its own way. Freya stood in the middle of it, watching as Minjun tried to explain something important while Minwo interrupted him and Minbin laughed for no reason at all. Jihoon stood beside her. She glanced at him, and he looked back at her the same way he always did. She realized something simple. She hadn't stayed because it was easy. She had stayed because it was real. And real was exactly what she had been running from all along. Now, she wasn't running anymore. She was home. Now. Like she belonged there. And for the first time, she didn't second-guess it. She simply accepted it. Freya reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers naturally. And as the boys' laughter filled the room and the city moved endlessly beyond their walls, she realized something simple. She hadn't stayed because it was easy. She had stayed because it was real. And real was exactly what she had been running from all along. Now, she wasn't running anymore. She was home. 2 months later, Jihoon hosted a party and it was unlike anything Freya had ever experienced. The penthouse shimmered with soft gold light, crystal glasses, white roses, and elegant guests filling every corner of the room. A live quartet played gentle music near the window while Seoul sparkled below like a second sky. Freya stood beside Jihoon in a deep emerald dress that fit her beautifully, though her hands were cold despite the warmth of the room. She had spent the evening smiling, greeting guests, and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the world Jihoon came from. Still, every time she looked at him, calm and composed in his dark tailored suit, she felt strangely safe. The boys had been dressed in tiny suits too, running around happily until they were finally gathered together at the far side of the room with their nanny. Then the music softened. Conversations faded. Jihoon turned to her, took her hand, and led her into the center of the room. Freya's heart began to pound. She looked at the guests, then back at him, sensing something big was about to happen. Jihoon did not look nervous. He looked sure. "Freya," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "When you came into my life, I did not expect anything. I did not expect laughter in my home, warmth in my heart, or the kind of peace I feel when I see you with my sons." Freya's eyes filled immediately. "You brought love into places I thought had gone cold," he continued. "You stood beside me when you could have walked away. You made my house a family. And I do not want to spend another day pretending I do not want forever with you." He lowered himself onto one knee. The entire room gasped. Freya covered her mouth, shaking now, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Freya," he said softly, holding out the ring, "will you marry me?" For one breathless second, the world stood still. Then Freya laughed through her tears and nodded over and over. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course yes." The room erupted in applause. The boys cheered Faust, running toward them in delight. Jihoon stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and pulled Freya into a kiss that felt like a promise, a beginning, and a home all at once.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please do not forget to like this video, subscribe, and share to your friends. See you on our next story. Bye.